So as we talk about coherence this morning, I want you to think about what that dialogue is going to look like with your administrative team when you meet with them in July. And what are you going to say to them when you meet with them to plan that retreat in May? So be thinking from that specific perspective. What is it that I'm going to say? If you choose to say anything, make sure that you have it clear, crystal clear in your mind as you move forward. I'm hoping also that you will experience the power of dialogue. I don't know, many of you, we kind of went floating back there today with Frères, but many of you did work and probably are really well aware of Jane Vella's work and the notion of dialogue education, and that's a universal notion across cultures. And the dialogue is just the start. I want her quote because it's so critical. The means is the dialogue. The end is the learning. The purpose is peace. Jane Vella. The means is the dialogue. The end is learning. The purpose is peace. And we can take that in the context of international work with children, with students, with faculty and staff, and we can take it in the context of our own schools and communities. So be thinking about dialogue today as a vehicle for learning. And it goes back to Beth's moral imperative, that those are the pieces that are most critical for us. And I think that's laced through Fullen's work. As we think about the work of Fullen, I'd like to remind you of our futures protocol, because we did work, before we began reading Fullen's book, we did that protocol that Andy led us through at our last meeting in January, and I have copies of that so that you have a hard copy in front of you if you choose. But that was a protocol that is an NSF protocol that you can use with your staff, but it will ultimately result in your staff saying, how are we going to get there? Or your leadership team saying, how are we going to get there? And what I'd like to suggest is that Fullen's notion of coherence and his framework will allow your group, whatever leadership team that is that you're working with, to move beyond the vision into some specific strategies with the right drivers. And Fullen talks a lot about the right drivers. So I think this pertains to our work right now. And we're going to be thinking a bit about how is it that we create a state of high expectations and strong ownership? How do we create a culture? Libby talked about the culture being the behavior. How do we create the culture for strong climate for change? What is it that's going to make a difference for our supervisory union, for our district? Because remember, we're going beyond the school base as we're talking about Fullen's model. We're looking at region. We're looking at a broader perspective. How do we make that difference? He talks a lot about explicitness of strategy, that we have to be incredibly explicit about how we're going to use time, or how we're going to engage kids, or how we're going to promote deep learning. So that explicitness of strategy is something that I hope you'll listen for today, and I hope you'll dig deeply to find that today as you're working with colleagues. Precision, clarity, and a measure of success. Those are the things that you want to emerge from the dialogue that's happening in your school district. We need to talk the walk. And then we need to move to action. And those are Fullen's words. We need to talk the walk. And then we move to action. And that's his notion of simplexity. How do we reduce that focus to a place where we can talk the walk? And everyone can talk the walk. And the dialogue goes on long enough that the talk emerges and the walk shifts as the group shapes it to own it. And then we have that internal accountability that he talks about in the book. He creates a framework, and his framework is a framework that is critical for us in order to think about moving forward. But he cautions us not to think about the framework as having to be linear or the same for every group, every person, every organization that chooses to use it. So the questions that he poses are around coherence. What is it and how do you get there? And the other quote that I thought was interesting, and we have to look at our own belief system, is most people would rather be challenged for change than mired in frustration. Now with that comes ample support. Most people would rather be challenged by change than mired in frustration. So coherence, the right drivers for action in schools, districts, and systems. And Fullen, I always talk about Fullen as writing this, but it's Fullen and Joanne Quinn. So his framework talks about the focusing direction, it talks about the collaborative culture, it talks about deepening learning, and it talks about accountability. And those are pieces that we've all reflected on, and many of you brought to me some of your, the work and the focus that you said was most challenging. What I have to share with you today is what he calls his workbook. Is that right, Linda? Linda was able to share this with us earlier in the winter, and I made copies for you. This is online. This is the link on the screen for you to get it. I'm never quite sure how long these things will stay up. So you have a hard copy for your files, but you have a hard copy to use today. So as we begin to work with this book and this booklet, you'll see 6 modules that will allow you to go deeper with your own staff, and it'll allow you to fairly quickly pull out some pieces that you may be able to use today as you work in subgroups. I'd like us to start with one of his protocols, and many of the protocols are outlined pretty clearly here and are quite simple. They typically are 20 to 30 minutes. I'd like us to start on page 2. It is a module, it's the first module, and it talks about the notion of coherence and when you're seeking and what we're meaning when we seek coherence. Many of you have listened to Fullen's books. Many of you have listened to some of his talks. You've read possibly the book or parts of it. But he talks about the notion of coherence at the beginning of this book. Typically, we would do a protocol where you would go around and ask people to find a passage that was interesting to them. I think this is an interesting alternative to that protocol because Fullen has pulled out 7 passages. And his invitation to you is to circle the one that you liked best. It will refresh for you the essence of his definition of coherence, but put down the key essence of what you would talk about with your leadership team in May when you're planning the retreat, if you are going to be talking about coherence with your leadership team in July. If you choose to use this book and you want to launch that by talking about the need for coherence, this will give you an entry point that's pretty quick. So let's try it, and this will give you a chance to take a look at that protocol. we okay? That's good.
Thank you.
I'd like us to return to the notes that we kept when we did the Futures Protocol on January 29th. That was a protocol that we worked through, Rick facilitated with us to try to get us to think about what would our perfect world look like, our coherent world look like 10 years from now. In 2020, 2025, where would we be? What would we be looking at as we entered that time period? And what would we need to go through in order to get there? That was an NSF protocol that we used. And if you go to the last page of our notes, you will see a question that we asked, how can we get to the future? And we talked about a variety of strategies that were pretty global. And that's okay, because they would need to be fleshed out. But I just pulled them out to show you how they aligned with Fullen's framework. When we said we want to rethink time, focusing direction. So his framework had 4 components. We want to stop the overload and fragmentation, focusing direction. We want infrastructure that emphasizes outputs, evidence-based culture, that internal accountability. We want to develop leadership of a collaborative system. That's the cultivating our collaborative cultures. We want to involve students. We want to elevate performance, deep learning, using our technology and our pedagogy, not one without the other, to move us forward. Organizational proficiency, and that's where we're talking about securing accountability. We're not laying on that external accountability, we're securing accountability. So take a deep dive into Fullen's work. I asked you, what were the biggest pieces that you found confounding as you were doing the work in your districts? And some of you were able to get back and be able to throw out some of those pieces that you were really stymied by. What pieces would you like to spend some time with today is the question that was in my mind as I did your learning needs assessment with you via an email to you at the beginning of the week. And as I said, some of these, I knew I would get some, and I knew I wouldn't get them from everybody, and that's okay. But it gave me that boots on the ground feel that I no longer have. I needed to know what you were experiencing right now. Several of you said shaping principles as lead learners. That was a really big one. Shared focus. How do we create a regional focus in a culture of autonomy? Was another one. And if you choose to talk about that, you could find a protocol on page 12 or 13 that might help you focus. It might not, but it's there. You can go to it. But please also go back into the book to find pieces around that notion. Creating a culture of leadership development and retention. I think it was Val that talked about the fact that we bring these people up and we have these great leaders who do develop coherence and they leave. And then we start again. So what do we do? How do we develop? But most of all, how do we retain? Determining measures of success. How do you measure the impact of professional learning? Not necessarily about the food or how comfortable the venue was. How do we cultivate a collaborative learning culture that moves to action? And that action was big. How do we develop true internal accountability that can be owned and sustained by building-based leadership? So that goes along with your principle piece, but you might want to be looking at that internal accountability piece. And then the question of how do we get to deep levels of implementation? Now, I just suggested here some pages that might be interesting protocols for you to use. Most of the protocols in this tool are only 15 minutes. They're 15 to 20 minutes, and they'll get you started talking. My challenge to you is that you head out and take a deep dive. Your goal is to explode the myths around these things, come back with a pragmatic strategy, and at least one or two quotes from Fullen that relate.